Hello everybody and welcome back to Odin's movie blog. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and I'm trying something out today, so let us know if there's any issues. But I am joined today by the one and only Matthew Kadish. What's going on, dude? Good to see you as well. Awesome, absolutely great to have you here. And I guess just to start us off, since it was my newest video today and we're talking about it. So Rian Johnson came out with another tweet where he talked about how he got rid of his Twitter, or he got rid of the tweet that went after Mike Zero because he was sorry, one second, I have to fix my webcam really quick. There we go. All right. So he felt really bad, or rather he said that he thought that his comment was a little too mean, and so that's the reason why he decided to delete his his comments, but he didn't actually apologize for them. So what are your thoughts on the whole Rian Johnson Twitter situation?
As a writer director, and so like I have a little bit of insight into how it works. But the people in Rian Johnson's position, they're very insulated, and they kind of live in a bubble where they have people who like handle them, or like do stuff for them, and they're kind of removed from everyday reality. And that's one of the reasons why you see so many Hollywood celebrities who are just like, they don't understand how the rest of the country works or how the rest of the world works or whatever, because of this insulation. And like when I read about how he had, someone on the production who would monitor like YouTube and stuff like that, that makes perfect sense, because that's just part of, the team that the director oversees. Is they have like these little groups that, they're designed to like go out and scout locations, or monitor Twitter or monitor YouTube, or find out what people are saying, what's everyone's theory, so like I know what to avoid or what to play off of, or things like that.
Yeah. And
so like I'm sure that he was not only aware of Mike Zero, but he was probably aware of like every major like Star Wars YouTuber or tweeter or Facebooker, and all the theories like that they were coming up with. And when he tweeted about like, oh, we zeroed it, or whatever the line was,
yeah,
that was probably just him being like, hey, well, this is how I talked with my coworkers and my friends when we were making the movie. And he probably didn't really think anything of it, just because Rian Johnson, he's one of those guys who, he doesn't use Twitter for business. He uses it as a personal thing, like most of us do. And he obviously wasn't thinking that it was a big deal, because it was just part of like his everyday life within that bubble that he lives in. And so when he probably had someone come to him who monitors this stuff and be like, hey, there's some backlash about what you said, and he was like, I think that he probably removed it, not so much that it was mean, but so much that it was giving Mike Zero more attention than he wants him to have. So I don't think he was sorry that he tweeted about it. I think he just removed it and said that it was mean as the justification, when in reality, like, he didn't want to say like, well, I don't want to give this guy too much attention.
So you don't think that it was because like a lot of us speculate that it came from higher ups, possibly Disney, possibly Lucasfilm, telling him to get the comment out there.
No.
And you say that because a couple of people were wondering, because the audio wasn't working for the very beginning, but I got it working now. So you mentioned the very beginning, though, that the reason why you have this kind of insight is because of the fact that you've worked with Hollywood types, you've worked within the Hollywood structure, and so you have that kind of
I was a struggling writer director in Hollywood for a number of years, and I've been in pitch meetings, and I've worked with producers, and I made a movie with Jeremy Renner, who he's Hawkeye in the Avengers now. He's a big,
that's just so awesome.
Big superstar. Yeah, he was a great guy too, amazing actor.
Yeah.
So like I've been around Hollywood. I lived in Hollywood for like 10 years. I have friends who still live there. I worked at Paramount Studios for a time. I've been around the block, and I've dealt with people, famous people, and kind of know how, those people operate and how the business operates and stuff like that. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there about how Hollywood does things. And, when I see a lot of this news pop up, whether it be through regular news outlets or through YouTube or what have you, a lot of this misconception about how the Hollywood business works and how the people who thrive in that business operate kind of makes a lot of that news not quite accurate, because they don't understand, how it really operates. They're looking at it from a common sense perspective, where, oh, well, the business I work at would do this, so therefore Disney would probably do this with this person. It's like, no, they don't operate that way. You have to understand that Rian Johnson's not an employee of Disney. Okay, he's an independent contractor. He is contracted by Lucasfilm. Like, that's who he has his development deal with. Now, Disney obviously owns Lucasfilm. So if Disney wanted to, they could issue an order, and if he wanted to keep his job, he'd have to follow it.
Yeah.
But I think for the most part, Disney doesn't really police people's Twitter accounts, especially considering the fact that Rian Johnson isn't like a direct employee.
Okay.
So
would you say that it may have been different in the situation of Pablo Hidalgo, where he did a lot of comments too, and then all of a sudden his Twitter got deleted, and then he started over, and then it was all cordial, it was all very nice, and it was just very off-putting because it was the total opposite of what he had done beforehand? Do you think that maybe because he has more close ties to the Lucasfilm, the writing group, the story group, the infamous story group, that maybe that had more to do with some order from the top rather than this situation?
It was my understanding that he was an employee of Lucasfilm. Is that right?
Yeah. So he's a part of the story group. So
so because he was an employee of Lucasfilm, if his Twitter was like overly toxic or negative, it could be that someone at Lucasfilm came to him and was like, look, you can still tweet, but we don't want the backlash that your Twitter account is getting, so you need to close this down, but you can open a new account. Just make sure that it's a business-friendly account as opposed to a personal account. These are the types of conversations where, it's a public relations thing. Yeah. And the way Disney operates is they'll acquire these companies like Lucasfilm, Marvel, Pixar, stuff like that. And the corporate culture at Disney, at least under Bob Iger, his tenure, and I think it was also under Eisner too, the guy who was there before Iger, who ran Disney. Their approach to a lot of this stuff is that when they acquire a business, they'll let the business run like as it did before they acquired it. Disney doesn't get down into the weeds and micromanage these businesses. They let them run by the people who ran the thing that made them worth acquiring in the first place, like John Lasseter. Yeah. When they acquired Pixar, they let John Lasseter continue to run Pixar as he had before they bought him out. Same thing with Marvel Studios. When Marvel Studios was doing all this stuff with Kevin Feige at the helm, they acquired Marvel, and they were like, well, we're not going to change anything. You guys just keep doing what you're doing. So they have a very hands-off approach to how these companies like run within their organization. Now, if there's like a huge problem that requires them to step in, they'll do that. But for the most part, they're the Warren Buffett model of company acquisition, where they'll buy a company and they'll just kind of oversee it and collect the profits and make sure everything's running smoothly, and let them go off and do their own thing. So any type of like change of an employee's like social media habits or something like that, it stems from one of two places. It would either come from the leadership within that company, such as Lucasfilm, or it would come from the personal decision of the person running that social media account. So if Pablo had said, I'm getting a lot of negative attention from this, I'm just going to shut everything down so that people can't, attack me anymore, and then I'm just going to be very kind of like PC going forward, So chances are somebody at the top probably did tell him that.
Yeah.
But if you look at these things with Disney, like Roseanne's Twitter account and James Gunn's Twitter account and stuff like that, Disney doesn't go to people in their employ and be like, hey, no Twitter.
Yeah.
You know, like they don't do those mandates. But if something blows up from Twitter, Disney's an interesting studio because they have a very specific corporate culture, which is kind of different from the other studios out there. I know every time I was on the Disney lot, it was all very, I guess, like family friendly, I guess you could say, very, very strict in like how people were supposed to purport themselves on the lot.
Yeah.
They actually have employee manuals. Like if you work at Disney, you're not allowed to grow your hair to a certain length if you're a man. They have like grooming standards that you have to, abide by. If you work at like they do this for the amusement parks.
I say it sounds almost in a lot of ways like the old school studio system where they just own so many different elements of who you are.
Well, the thing about Disney is that because of its family image, like that's so ingrained and like it's how people perceive the company, that they have these standards that all employees have to abide by in order to, preserve this family-friendly image. Mm-hmm. And part of that is like, like if you're a Disney employee, you're kind of representative of the studio. So you have to look a certain way and you have to act a certain way. And, if you step outside those bounds, you can get fired for it. And, I had a friend who actually worked on the Disney lot in animation for a while. And he would tell me about all the crazy like rules of like how you had to look, like he had to shave his beard and like all this other stuff.
Wow.
So, it doesn't surprise me when, I see people like Roseanne and James Gunn and stuff like that get fired by Disney because of, something that was inappropriate or minorly inappropriate or what have you.
Yeah.
Simply because I know their corporate culture. Like nobody who jokes about pedophilia would, be continued to be employed by Disney if it became, like a big public thing.
Yeah, that's very true.
So but there's my guess is like there's a leadership structure in Lucasfilm with Kathleen Kennedy at the top, but she has her lieutenants who run the day-to-day stuff. Because Kathleen Kennedy, I think she's more kind of involved in the big picture decisions for Lucasfilm as opposed to the day-to-day running of the studio.
Yeah.
And my guess is like whoever oversees the story group was probably the person who went to Pablo and said like, hey, cut it out. Especially considering the fact, like with what's been happening with Roseanne and James Gunn. And it's like, look, your Twitter account can get you fired, so be very careful with it.
Yeah. But
in terms of Rian Johnson, I don't think anyone from Lucasfilm came to him and said, you need to remove this tweet. I think it was a personal decision because he realized in making light of someone that he didn't like, he was giving them a lot more publicity than he wanted to.
Yeah.
So that's probably why he decided to walk that back.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see because you say that that a lot of the speculation that we have about how possibly Rian Johnson, possibly Kathleen Kennedy are in trouble with their jobs. Do you think there's any truth behind that speculation? There's a lot of rumors that Kathleen Kennedy might voluntarily step down in September. Like, do you think that that's a possibility, or what do you think the future is right now?
I think there is zero possibility Kathleen Kennedy will voluntarily step down.
Wow.
You gotta remember that the metrics by which Disney is judging the success of Star Wars is based off of dollars and cents. They spent $4 billion on the franchise. And when The Force Awakens was getting ready to come out, Disney was very hands-on in how that movie was getting made and, what was going into it and stuff like that. Like Bob Iger was looking at dailies, directly from J.J. Abrams, and he was sending him notes because, the $4 billion franchise was riding on how strong The Force Awakens premiered. So the Disney studio execs had a lot of attention focused on that movie in particular. But once that movie hit big, the studio was like, okay, like we can relax now. We're off to a good start. Kathleen Kennedy, the ship is yours. So because most people at the top of these studios, like they're overseeing like a ton. It's not just Lucasfilm. They're overseeing their theme parks. They're overseeing Pixar, Marvel. They're overseeing, like ABC, their TV networks. And they often have like, radio properties and like, sports teams and billboard operation. Like they're huge. They're these gigantic conglomerates. So the guy who's running everything, Bob Iger, he's not just overseeing like Lucasfilm. Like to him, Lucasfilm, he probably gets a report every couple days or once a week or something like that about like what they're up to, and he reads it like you'd read a news article on Yahoo or Drudge Report or something like that. And he's just like, oh, okay, and they'll probably have financial breakdowns of everything that's going on. And so when it comes to Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm, every movie they've done except for Solo has been profitable, right?
Well, I mean, and that's the reason why I have my own speculation, because I don't think anyone who greenlights a project that loses, according to the math that I've done on it, $200 million at least loss on Solo, I don't see how that person keeps their job. And she was the one that greenlit the project. She's the one that fired Lord and Miller. She's the one that rehired somebody else. And so to me, if I was the one running Disney and Lucasfilm, or if I was the one running Disney, I would say, all right, you just cost us money. We're on this downward trajectory. We need something new to get everything back on track. At least that's how I would perceive it. How do you think that they're perceiving it from what you know about how things work out there?
Well, here's the thing. If you work in Hollywood, you're always going to have a flop at some point.
Yeah.
Pretty much every studio executive has dealt with, financial disasters when it comes to movies. When it came to Solo, that was really Kathleen Kennedy's only misstep, because up to that point, she had The Force Awakens, which was a huge success. She had Rogue One, which made money, and she also had The Last Jedi, which, as much as I dislike that movie, it did make money.
True, and that's the reason why too, because and it's one of those things where, because I always look at the numbers and like Force Awakens made $2 billion. Last Jedi made $1.3 billion, and that's a $700 million loss in my mind. I think, okay, why? Like, we knew that there would be a drop, but not by that much. And if you just look at the trajectory of all these films, it just seems like they're on that downward trend. And so that's why, to me, I feel like they need something to shake up the current direction of Lucasfilm. At least that's what it seems like.
Well, but at the end of the day, you got to realize that these people, they're entrenched. Like, Kathleen Kennedy is technically a Disney studio executive, right? She may be in charge of Lucasfilm, but she's not an employee of Lucasfilm. She's an employee of Disney. Disney is the one who has her on their board. Like if you go to Disney's website and you look at the list of the executive structure under Disney, you'll see that Kevin Feige is up there, right underneath Kathleen Kennedy, and like people from Pixar and stuff like that. So she runs a division of Disney. Okay, this is like saying like, we got into a war with North Korea, so we should fire the Secretary of State. It's not so easy to just fire the Secretary of State, So the same thing's true with these studio executives. They're usually entrenched, like they have contracts with Disney, which states terms that kind of protect their position. So like if she were to get fired, okay, let's just say that Bob Iger is like, I don't like Kathleen Kennedy, let's get rid of her. Okay, once that decision is made, there's a lot of kind of ripple effects that come from that. The biggest of which is, what's her severance package? Like, what was the deal that they made when they first brought her on? Is she going to get like $50 million of a golden parachute or something like that? Is she going to continue to get a back end percentage of all future Star Wars films, or the films that she had put into the process of getting made before she was fired, that type of thing. So there's a financial aspect to removing an executive from a position. But in addition to that, she's only had technically one flop, which was Solo.
And I guess I guess when I hear that it was one flop, it was Solo, but it was also the first time that any Star Wars property ever in its history had ever lost money. And so
it's not going to lose money though. Like that's your primary fallacy here, is that Solo is not going to lose money ultimately. Now, it didn't make its money back in the box office, but you have to remember that movies are monetized across many different fields. So, for instance, you have home video, you have foreign distribution of home video, you now have streaming, you have airlines, you have the hotel market, the pay-per-view hotel market, and then you have syndication. For like TV networks and stuff like that. So like when I went to the Cannes Film Festival in 2004 to sell my movie, the one that starred Jeremy Renner, one of the interesting things that I learned while I was out there is that Cannes isn't just a film festival, it's a film market. And what that means is like people who own movies go there and they have like this big convention center and they sell these movies to people who want the rights to, show them, whether it be in theater or on TV or in home, like DVD, and now streaming and stuff like that. So like you could go to a booth and you could say like, yeah, I want to get all of Arnold Schwarzenegger's movies for my Croatian TV station. And then like they'll pay like a certain amount of money to get the rights to show those movies in Croatia. And so like you can sell a single movie multiple times to many, many different markets.
How much do you think they make usually off of those other products?
Way more than they spent on them. So the common belief is that if you have $100 million film, the marketing for that film equals the budget. So technically, you spent $200 million on a movie.
Usually, it's about half the budget. Usually,
I would say like it matches the budget.
Really? So you think? Well, then that makes the financial loss for Solo even worse than the $200 million that I said, because that's assuming a 50% take of the box office. I mean, of the 50% of its actual budget.
Well, here's another thing you have to consider as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so because Star Wars is such a hot property, Disney doesn't own theater chains. Okay, so theater chains are kind of like their own thing. They're called the exhibitors. Okay,
yeah.
So you have the distributor, which is Disney, and then you have the exhibitor, which are the different theater chains. And the theater chains want really popular movies which are guaranteed to be hits, because that brings people in. It gets them buying popcorn, candy, tickets, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to the box office, the way this works is usually the first week or two, the studio, the distributor, gets 90% of the ticket revenue for a movie. And then every week after that, it goes down like 10% until it evens out at 50-50. So Disney, because they have the Star Wars property, they're able to go to these exhibitors and say like, look, you have to guarantee us a run of at least 2 months, regardless of how well the movie's doing.
Yeah.
You need to give us a bigger cut for a longer period of time, like whatever that may be. Disney kind of strong-armed all the theater chains into very stringent terms in order to show the Star Wars movies, because the theater chains knew Star Wars is just going to be like a guaranteed hit. So they were willing to kind of, go along with Disney for these crazy demands, which they normally wouldn't do for any other movie. So my guess is Disney probably got a larger share of the initial box office than they normally would. But, in addition to all this stuff, so, whenever you watch a movie on an airplane, those movies were sold, the rights to those movies were sold to that airline individually. All right. So that's one revenue stream. If you go to a hotel room and you do a pay-per-view movie, that was individually negotiated with that hotel chain. And so you have there's all these different ways to monetize movies, so that even a movie that flops at the box office, that doesn't make its money back, in the long run, whether it be over the course of 1 year or 10 years, it's going to make its money back. So studios don't actually ever really lose money unless it's like a Heaven's Gate situation where they spent like way more and leveraged, their capital, and it was just such a huge flop that there was no way that they could make that money back in time to pay back, the interest or their investors or what have you.
Well, I guess like the thing that kind of irks me about that though is, you know, you have this concept then of why do we even consider movies to be flops if in the long run most of them will make their money back, and also why then do studios cancel projects of series, for example, the Divergent series? Why did that get canceled if they were just going to make their money up in the long run? Like, that's why for me, I can understand why they can definitely make money after a film. Like, obviously there are those other revenue streams, but I think there's also a point where the loss is so great that it merits someone taking another look to say, should we invest any more in this property?
It's not so much about the long run profit; it's about the short term liquidity. So, for instance, you know, you talked about the Divergent series,
yeah,
and in that situation, that was a movie made by Lionsgate, I believe, and Lionsgate, you know, they realized that the sequels to that movie made, you know, less profit than the original one did. Mm-hmm. And so they looked at the cost of doing a fourth movie where, you know, the actors, as a series goes on, actors tend to get, number one, more money up front, mm-hmm. and number two, a bigger cut at the back end, mm-hmm. And that's just something that, you know, their representatives negotiate with the studios once the contract is signed. So before Divergent was even made, a lot of these people were probably had a contract that said, okay, for movie number one, you get paid like $1 million. Just a figure I'm pulling out of the air. For movie number two, $2 million. For movie number three, $3 million, like whatever. But in reality, it's probably closer to like 10, 15, 20, you know, something like that. But in addition to that, they would be like, okay, so the back end take, if the movie makes, like, let's say like $50 million at the box office, my client gets like 1% of the back end of profits. If the movie makes $100 million, my client gets 2%, you know, like so on and so forth. And when you have a series where you have like Shailene Woodley, that guy who played Four, you have Miles Teller, and people like Ashley Judd and like all these other people, that stuff adds up and it cuts into, you know, the profits of these movies. And by the time they got to the third one, I think a lot of interest had kind of waned, and they saw Lionsgate saw the writing on the wall, and they were like, look, if we make a fourth movie, the budget is going, and, you know, all of our profit structure, like, we're not going to make any money. In fact, we'll probably lose money. Yeah. And we're going to have this huge outlay of expense in order to, you know, just get the film made. And like, we may not even make that much back. So it was a liquidity question where they're like, you know, if we did a TV show, we could do it cheaper, mm-hmm. and we could, you know, spin that off into a TV series and get syndication money in the long run and all this other stuff. So there was a lot of this, you know, kind of like behind the scenes, inside baseball decision making that went into, you know, kind of deciding to cancel the movie series and move it into a TV show. Mm-hmm. The problem is like, you had these actors under contract, and Lionsgate was like, oh, we'll just move this into you know, the TV, and the actors and their representatives were like, no, we signed a contract for a movie. Yeah. You know, and so like that contract dispute basically had Lionsgate say like, you know, screw it, you know, we're not going to bother with this thing anymore. Okay. And so like you have all these like tiny, crazy, unknown business factors that go into a lot of this stuff. And when it comes to a movie like Solo, like you can say like, yeah, like Solo was a bomb, but like, if you look at it from the industry point of view, Solo is going to make its money back. In the long run, it's not going to be a loss for Disney, okay? It was really only Kathleen Kennedy's like mishandling of how that movie was made that put it in the position that it was in. Now, one flop is not going to be enough for Disney to decide to remove an executive because, like I said before, in that business, in the Hollywood business, the movie business, flops are just a part of life. They happen, you know. Now,
do you think that is more likely, at least for the Solo situation, do you think it's more likely that any plans that they maybe had with that franchise, with the Solo specific franchise, do you think those plans might be dead because of how much money it lost? Do you think that's more of a possibility, or do you think that they're just going to keep pushing forward with everything they had planned?
Well, they've already stated that they're not going to be pushing. Like, they had, you know, they had this plan where they were going to release a Star Wars movie every year. Yeah. And they had like the Star Wars story films, which would focus on individual characters, and then they had like the trilogy films, which would focus on, you know, expanding the saga. Yeah. so to speak. So like they had this game plan, and when Solo flopped, I think people at Disney and Lucasfilm kind of got together and said like, okay, well, obviously, why did it flop? And the behind the scenes shenanigans were obviously a factor, but I think a lot of them bought into the idea of franchise fatigue. Like they were just putting out too many Star Wars movies too quickly. And there was probably a line of thinking there where they were like, hey, maybe people are kind of sick of these old Star Wars characters. Maybe we should hold off on doing a lot of these Star Wars stories because people just aren't into the characters,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much truth there is to that, because I mean, I point this out every time I hear that. Yeah, because I mean that might be their mindset, but like you can easily thwart it by saying, yeah, but look at Marvel, they're putting out films almost every 6 months. And
well, you have to also understand too that Marvel has a very different culture than Lucasfilm does. So Marvel, the guy at the top of Marvel, Kevin Feige.
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce his name?
Yes, that's how I've always pronounced it. So okay. I'm assuming.
All right. I always get him and Paul Feig confused.
Yeah, me too. Like I always because I'd hear all these things about Paul Feig, and I'm like, I don't like Paul Feig's work half the time. And then Kevin Feige, I'm like, I love everything Kevin Feige does.
But if you look at Kevin Feige, so Kevin Feige was a comic book guy. Like he came from the source material. And kind of transitioned into this like creative overseer and became a producer. Yeah. So he had a very great understanding of who these characters were and what made them like interesting. Like if you look at so much of Marvel's success, it's been with like B and C list characters like Ant-Man and Doctor Strange and all these like Guardians of the Galaxy. No one knew who the Guardians of the Galaxy were before they made a movie out of them. But Kevin Feige looked at these characters and he knew what made them work in the comics, and he's like, okay, let's take what worked in the comics and translate that into movie form, and the people who love the comics will come along with that. We'll be introducing it to a whole new audience who's going to fall in love with what makes these characters special in the first place. Yeah, you don't have that type of vision at Lucasfilm. Like Kathleen Kennedy, I don't think she's a bad producer. She comes from this school where, okay, first of all, you have to know who Kathleen Kennedy is. Kathleen Kennedy, she started off as an assistant to Spielberg, and she eventually kind of worked her way up to being his primary producer. And she's married to another super producer named Frank Marshall, who's done like a ton of big movies. And there's this kind of trifecta going on there where you have Kennedy, Spielberg, and Marshall. Those were like the three kind of big partners in Kathleen Kennedy's career. Okay, her, Steven Spielberg, Frank Marshall, her husband. She met George Lucas while they were making, I believe, the first Indiana Jones movie. And so like she became friends with George Lucas that way. And George Lucas had a working relationship with her throughout the course of however many years. And when George Lucas decided to step down, that's when he approached Kathleen Kennedy about taking over for him for Lucasfilm, because he saw how she worked. And what makes Kathleen Kennedy a good producer is that she runs interference for the creative people so that they can focus on just being creative and everything else is handled. So she's like a logistical producer. Mm-hmm. And she's the type of producer that as a director you would want to have. So for instance,
unless you're Lord and Miller.
Well, even for Lord and Miller, like she, when Kathleen Kennedy took over Lucasfilm, she kind of came in with this concept of finding diamonds in the rough, like inexperienced directors, people who weren't A-listers, but had talent, and then elevating them and giving them what they needed to create a unique Star Wars experience. Okay, this is what led her to initially get Rian Johnson, Colin Trevorrow, Josh Trank, like all these young up and coming directors. And Lord and Miller were a part of that. They had done 21 Jump Street and the Lego Movie, but they hadn't really done like a big like live action like spectacle like blockbuster film before. Okay. And they're obviously talented guys. And the way that Kathleen Kennedy works is she doesn't kind of get in there and interfere with the creative process. What she does is she tries to give the directors like her broad ideas, mm-hmm. and let them go off and do their own thing while she makes sure that they get what they need to bring their vision to life. It's what she did with Spielberg for every one of his movies. It's what she did with Lucas when they did, the Indiana Jones films. It's what she did for, the Jurassic World movies, the directors who followed Steven Spielberg on those. Like, she just has this MO of, kind of being hands-off in terms of the creative process. Now, when it came to Lord and Miller, that hands-off process worked against her because they were just too all over the place. When you're doing 40 takes of a single scene, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like everything I know about how Lord and Miller went about shooting Solo, I can see why Kathleen Kennedy eventually fired them, because these guys, they were not focused. They were kind of all over the place. I believe that their choice to cast Ehrenhart or Ehrenreich.
So it's Alden Ehrenreich.
Yeah, Alden Ehrenreich. Even though I liked him in the movie, I believe that he probably didn't have the chops to do what Lord and Miller ultimately wanted him to do, or at least what Kathleen Kennedy wanted from the character.
Yeah. Because
Kathleen Kennedy was very focused on the characters of Star Wars more so than the story. That's why there was no like overarching plan. She was all about, if we have characters people love, people will show up for the movie. She didn't really
I
think
guess
about...
that's the reason why, like, because I'm just reading a few people in the chat, like Pompiani and a couple others, where like they heard you say what makes Kathleen Kennedy a good producer, and they just cringed at the concept and the. But for me, it's just like, to me, I think there definitely can be an argument for why she is good at certain things in her role. But I also think you can't.
Keep this in mind. There's a difference between being a good studio head.
Okay.
And a good producer.
Okay, gotcha.
Now
would you say that she's not a good studio head, but a good producer? Would you say that?
Yeah. So what I'm saying here is, like, as a producer, her job is to get a movie made, to actually produce a movie and hand it off to the studio for distribution. So things like getting actors, getting locations, keeping track of the budget, all the logistical stuff. That's what she is good at. That's what she did for Spielberg. Like if you like any of Steven Spielberg's movies, Kathleen Kennedy had a big hand to play in making sure those movies ended up the way they did. Okay, so you can't say that she's a bad producer, because she's actually a very good producer. Her thing, though, is like she's always worked with really talented directors, particularly Spielberg. Okay, now when she transitioned into a studio executive role as the head of Lucasfilm, she took her method of operation as a producer and translated that as a studio executive, and it doesn't work the same way. And that's where the problem's coming in. Is she's basically giving the directors that she's hiring way too much freedom, whereas Kevin Feige, like, he'll come in and he'll tell Joss Whedon, like, F you, you're going to do this. I don't care how good your idea is. We have a plan. We're sticking to it.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's the difference here, is she let Lord and Miller do whatever they wanted, and it turns out whatever they wanted just wasn't working. Yeah. And so she actually had to kind of break her habit of hands-off approach to the creatives and go in there and kind of, fire them and right the ship, so to speak. And that's one of the reasons why I think Rian Johnson is so well entrenched, is because he was able to work with Kathleen Kennedy in the way that she prefers. He was able, like, Rian Johnson is actually a very, I'm going to say he's a good director on the technical end of things.
Yeah.
He's not a good writer.
Yeah. I was about to say, because, like, I guess, like,
we got to separate those two things. Yeah. He's not a good writer, but he's a competent director. I'll say that. He's a competent director. Okay. And his method of making The Last Jedi just was a dream for Kathleen Kennedy, and that's why she loved working with him so much. And it was from that working experience that she's like, you know what, let's give him another trilogy. Yeah. Because he's a guy, he was on budget, he was on schedule, he he made a good looking movie, he was just a dream to work with. And that's the crux of the Kathleen Kennedy Rian Johnson alliance right there, is just they work well together. They mesh well together. Whereas someone like Colin Trevorrow, for instance, didn't mesh well. Someone like Lord Miller didn't mesh well with Kathleen Kennedy. and the culture and the way she likes to work and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
that's why I guess, like, for me, I mean, I understand her as being a, as you said, being able to at least see her as a good producer. But when it comes to the studio head, I make this argument every time that I talk about why I personally think Kathleen Kennedy should have to step down. And it really comes down to the fact that she isn't that forward-thinking executive where she has these minds. She has, like, all of these different plots and all these different stories, planned out. As you said, she focuses more on, hey, we put these characters in a movie, people are going to show up. But I think what Solo showed is that that's not always going to be a guarantee. You're not going to be able to just put character names and character arcs and things of that sort, or rather lack of character arcs in a lot of situations, and have that be enough to sell a movie. So that's
that's the thing, though. Like, the Kevin Feige type of executive is the exception. He's not the rule. Mm-hmm. Most studio executives don't have a creative vision. They're there to kind of bridge the gap between the production and the studio, the people who are funding the film and the people who are making the film. And that's what Kathleen Kennedy, that's basically what her job boils down to. It's very rare for someone who's at the head of the division to kind of step in and say, like, hey, here's where we're going to go with this. It's kind of like you see the problem with the DC films, where you had basically the people the head of the motion picture group at Warner Brothers. Okay, he did not sit down and plot out, all this stuff. They hired Zack Snyder to kind of oversee the creative direction. And before that, it was like Christopher Nolan. And then they got like Jeff Johns and like all this other stuff. But the person who oversaw the creative umbrella under which all these movies kind of fell under was not the person who was responsible for greenlighting them or making them or what have you. And that's typically how it works in Hollywood. The person at the top, they'll make the final decisions, but they don't come up with the ideas because most of these people aren't very creative.
Yeah.
A lot of the studio executives, they're either lawyers, like, they have a law degree, or they have like a business degree or a finance background or something. They're someone who come from like the business world as opposed from the creative world. And so when you're comparing Kathleen Kennedy to Kevin Feige, it's not really a fair comparison, because Kevin Feige is one of those rare talents where he has the creative chops in addition to the business chops, whereas Kathleen Kennedy is more kind of like the business end of things. And, I think when she found Rian Johnson, that's one of those. At first it was J.J. Abrams. J.J. Abrams kind of came in and kind of laid out some of the groundwork for the overall, how Star Wars is going to work. But I think her husband, Frank Marshall, and Steven Spielberg also had a lot of input into the strategy, behind like what type of movies they were going to make. But then when she worked with Rian Johnson, she found someone who's like, okay, this guy could be my creative head. I could bring him in and he could kind of oversee everything creatively for me. Yeah. And that's where I think like giving him the new trilogy kind of played into things.
Yeah, because of the fact that she, again, thinks more on the business side of things. And in her mind, she said, yeah, okay, so Last Jedi made $1.3 billion, maybe not as much as the movie before, but it still made a profit. And also I liked working with him, so therefore, because I liked working with him, that's why it's a good decision. Not necessarily because he's a good writer, because that's something that you talk about a lot, at least that you split, 3 articles on Medium?
I think there were like 4 or 5. Like, I've lost count. I'm working on more, though.
I know that's kind of what got us kind of like started talking in the first place, was when you started to release these articles about The Last Jedi and being able to talk about it instead of using just the rhetoric that a lot of people on YouTube especially had been using. You were able to look at it from just an objective standpoint. And I love how you always start off your article saying, this is what I'm not going to do, this is what I am going to do, and then you would proceed to actually go out and do it. You would follow your own rules that you set out, which I loved about the article. That's the reason why I just started to eat them up, and I was so glad I was able to cover them in some of my videos, because, I mean, you were just so spot on in just the analysis of why, from an objective standpoint, the writing of Last Jedi was just not very good. So do you want to share maybe a little bit about the work that you do at Medium.com, some of the work that you do, and how you prepare your articles and the research that you do for them?
Well, a lot of it just comes from being like a film geek who trained to be a filmmaker. Like I went to college, I got a film degree. I went to the LA Film School for my master's. So like I've studied film, I've studied writing, I've studied creative writing, I've studied English literature, I've studied film theory. I worked with like very talented people when I worked in Hollywood. And I've been a lifelong fan of films and reading about films and studying films. And so a lot of it just comes down from, I don't do a whole lot of research because I already kind of know a lot of these concepts, a lot of these storytelling concepts. And my career right now, I no longer work in Hollywood. I'm a novelist. I actually write actual books. I call them paper Kindles. I've got work published on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, stuff like that. And I love it because, I don't have to deal with people, other people. Like it's my vision. I can tell the story I want to tell.
Yeah.
When in Hollywood, you have like a million different cooks kind of putting ingredients into your soup. And if you get even 60% of what you originally wanted onto the screen, like that's considered a victory.
So would you say that it just got me, for some reason, that description just got me thinking. So would you say that the introduction to the movie The Majestic is spot on, where the writer's in there and he has these producers and creative types just like tearing apart his script, trying to add things to it, and there's like trying to add a dog because, oh man, everyone loves dogs. So is that kind of how it is in Hollywood, where they're just like, oh, let's do this and this and this and this, and then you're left with 60% of what you're left with?
Oh yeah, like I've been in writers' rooms where fist fights have broken out because people were like, demanding that stuff get put in, and people were fighting against, resisting it. And you also have to take into account that there's a lot of ego at play in the entertainment industry. And I learned very early on that, feedback can be helpful, but you need to be open to the bad and the good feedback. So whenever I had people kind of giving me comments on my script, I would stay quiet. I wouldn't say anything. I'd just make notes of everything that people said, even if I disagreed with it. And then because in the moment you want to be defensive. You want to say like, no, we can't do this. We can't do that. Yeah. But like later on, you might look at your, the notes and be like, well, this person has a point. I should really, kind of figure out, like, I didn't like their suggestion, but the problem they pointed out is legit. So I need to come up with a better fix for that. Now, an issue comes into play where you have like producers who are like, well, my hot stripper girlfriend needs a role in this film because she wants to be an actress. And like, you have to, create a whole new character to, have this woman who has no acting chops whatsoever appear in the film. They're like, well, like we just sold product placement to Coca-Cola, so we need to have a scene in here where, people are drinking Coke. It's like, well, it's a historical period that happened in biblical times. It's like, well, figure it out, So like there are those types of things in there that a lot of filmmakers have to take into account. But getting back to, my critiques of The Last Jedi, and my Medium articles, basically the research I do, like I'll know these storytelling concepts just because like I studied this stuff, and I'll just find my references of like, well, I remember reading in this book this concept, so like I'll take out the book and I'll find the chapter that's at, and I'll be like, okay, like this is my reference point for my argument. And then like I'll look at The Last Jedi and I'll pick out the scene that violates that concept, and I'll just say like, quality is very subjective. Okay, like one person can watch a movie and be like, this movie sucked, and then another person can watch this movie and be like, what are you talking about? This movie was awesome. And it just comes down to personal preference. But there are, there are objective things that wouldn't. And we're not talking about audience members here. We're talking about the artists. Yeah. Okay. That artists have to be aware of when they're, making these movies. Yeah. And there's this kind of big disturbing trend on YouTube amongst film critics where they're like, you can't look at anything objectively. Objectivity does not exist in art. And
it just drives me crazy all the time. That's why that's why I'm so drawn to your articles, because you just say, no, that's not true. And the example to me that always just kind of explains it very well is the movie The Room, because it is, objectively speaking, no one in their right mind, no one worth their salt would ever say it's a good movie from like an objective filmmaking standpoint. But the fact that people love it is just like, again, shows you that there's that difference between that subjective and objective position.
The thing is like, I would say that there's no objective position for personal preference of audiences. Yeah. But you have to separate the audience from the craftsman. So like, you can make an argument that says that there's no such thing as objectivity in the consumption of movies.
Yeah.
But in the making of movies, there is objective standards that have to be beholden to. Like, for instance, if you made a movie that was entirely out of focus, right? Like the entire movie was just shot out of focus, and audiences would watch it and be like, well, I like out of focus movies. But technically, objectively, that's poor movie making.
Yeah.
It's bad movie making, because if you can't see what's on the screen in a visual medium, unless it's purposeful, unless like you're subverting expectations, because people go into expecting to see a in focus movie and they get a movie that's entirely out of focus.
Yeah.
You know, there's an objective standard there. Like any cinematographer who shot an entire movie out of focus on, you know, accidentally would never get work as a cinematographer again.
Never.
So as a writer, there are objective rules to writing and crafting stories that intelligent and skilled writers utilize. And if you just say like, well, subjectively, I don't agree with that, you know, that's your right. But that doesn't change the fact that, you know, these concepts exist and they've been proven and tested. You know, it's kind of like saying like, I don't agree with gravity.
Yeah.
You know, like I believe I can fly. And it's like, well, you can believe
that all you want, but it doesn't make it
but
true.
Physics says differently.
Daniel Webster in the chat made a good point. He says, objectively, the prequels are badly written films.
They are badly written.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say they were badly written. I would say that
dialogue. I would say the dialogue was not very good.
Actually, well, the dialogue wasn't very good in the original trilogy either.
Oh yeah.
But the real difference between the original trilogy and the prequels was the fact that George Lucas isn't a actor's director. Okay, I believe like he's a big idea technical director. Like he likes all like this, like the camera stuff, like shooting on digital, and he likes the idea that he can like create like these digital backgrounds and edit digitally, and like he was always on the forefront of technology.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like actors and emotion, I think a big problem with the prequels was the fact that the way George Lucas directed the actors sucked any emotion or any realism out of their performances. Because like it's just like that whiny cadence from, you know, all these characters. Because you have good actors in those movies. You have Natalie Portman and Ewan McGregor, and you know, I wouldn't say Hayden Christensen's a very good actor, but he's not like I've seen him in stuff where he's like,
I mean, I'm gonna say he's not Tommy Wiseau. I mean, no one's gonna say that he's, you know, that. Like,
I mean, like you got Samuel L. Jackson in there, and you got talented actors, and what's his name, Ian McDiarmid or whoever plays Palpatine.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I forget his name. Like he's a great actor. But Lucas, you know, like I don't think he comes in. See, as a director, okay, as someone who studied to be a director, a big part of a director's job is pulling the right performance out of an actor. And one of the great things about working in Hollywood on A-list projects is that the actors are so good that most directors don't need to do anything. Like the actors just show up and they're ready to go.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with like, you know, low budget stuff or like actors who aren't established or maybe haven't mastered their craft yet.
Sorry, Lando had to catch you. He said that you forgot to mention Liam Neeson. And so Lando says totally overlooks the dude who trained both Darth Vader and Batman.
Well, I mean, like, I didn't mean to overlook it.
Yeah, I know. I had to get that in there.
The point I'm trying to make here is that directing actors is part of the job, and it's a part of the job that Lucas was never really interested in or very good at. And when you're an actor on set and there's nothing around you, there's this green screen, like you have nothing to kind of base your performance on or like ground you in reality and stuff like that. Like acting can be a really hard job.
Yeah.
I remember there was I think it was on the commentary for the movie Sphere, where Sam Jackson was on that commentary, and we got to the scene where like the golden sphere showed up, and Sam Jackson was kind of talking about that scene. And he's like, yeah, you know, like when we're shooting the scene, you know, obviously that sphere doesn't exist. And in my head, I was imagining a silver sphere, not a golden sphere. So my performance in this scene was based off the idea that the sphere was silver, not gold. And like when I heard that, I was like, man, it's like what these actors have to go through, because unless the director can clearly communicate to them what exists in the scene when it's all green screen, it can be very difficult for the actors to deliver a convincing performance. And if you look at the performances in the prequels, a lot of them just feel like they're just reading lines. Like they're not really. And I think that was intentional from Lucas's part, where he's like, "This is how I want you to deliver these lines." And so the actors are like, "Well, he's George Lucas, so I give him what he wants." But like,
I don't know. I feel like if I was given a line of "I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere," that I'd probably ask a couple questions if it was me.
Well, but. Okay, Hayden Christensen, nobody knew who the hell he was until he got cast in that movie. He's not going to sit there and be like, "George, I can't say this line as it's written," because George would just be like, "Well, then I'll find another actor to to do it," or like like I'll just digitally move your mouth and have lines delivered by a voice actor or something like that. Like, actors don't, unless the actor is crucial to the movie. They don't have a lot of say in what goes into the making of the film. There's an old school kind of mentality among actors that you saw with like Gene Hackman, for instance. And Gene Hackman was the type of guy that if he got the sense that the director didn't know what he was doing, he wouldn't listen to him. He'd be like, "I know what's best for my character. Screw you. This is how I'm going to do it." But if he was working with the director who knew his stuff, then he would trust him. And that's what a lot of like major like A-list actors do is when they're working on a movie, if they get the sense that the director is a pushover or doesn't have a strong vision or doesn't know what he's doing, they'll just take over. Yeah. Like a good example of this is how Tom Cruise handled The Mummy, where you have Alex Kurtzman, who this was like his first major motion picture directing it. And Tom Cruise just took over, just walked all over the guy. And it happens all the time in Hollywood.
Which probably was not for the best, seeing that film pretty much killed any chance that the Dark Universe had of getting going.
Well, keep in mind, Tom Cruise makes pretty good movies. Imagine how bad the movie was before Tom Cruise took over.
Yeah, that's very true. But then again, like, is it that he's just put in good movies by his agent, or is it that he actually has a hand behind the scenes?
No, Tom Cruise has a hand in every movie he
makes. I believe that as far as like Mission Impossible goes, just because you know how much anyone knows
true.
just how much he does.
Every movie he makes.
Okay.
Every movie. It's been that way since the 80s.
Yeah.
Tom Cruise, he's not just an actor, he's a producer, but he's also the type of guy who once you get him in your movie, he's like in charge basically. Like, that's like you either partner with him or you're subservient to him. You're never above him. So, yeah.
I want to give a huge shout out just real quick to the Hunky Chunky Funky Monkey. I don't know if he's still in the chat, but he gave a €2 super chat and says, "Hail Allfather, hail Matthew, and hail the Valkyries." So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hunky Chunky, for that. Hail. And then Mecha Random says Alex Kurtzman needs to die in a fire. That's pretty
Alex, I'm constantly surprised at how successful he's been, because he's a terrible writer. His partner, his former partner, I should say, Roberto Orsi, I can't pronounce it.
I don't know.
He was an even worse writer, and the two of them together barely made mediocre stuff. But like, it's funny because if you look at Kurtzman's career, he's been involved in some of the biggest movies in Hollywood, some of the biggest franchises, but he's destroyed almost all of them. Yeah, like Star Trek. Like he was the brains behind Sony's Spider-Man.
That's probably why Mecha Random's a huge Star Trek fan. So that's probably.
Oh yeah, and now that he tanked the Dark Universe, he ran back to Star Trek, and he's the one who's producing the second season of Discovery. So that's a whole nother basket of eggs to talk about. Yeah. But okay, getting back to the medium stuff.
Yeah.
So like I have a lot of these concepts that I try to apply to The Last Jedi to objectively prove from the craftsman's perspective, from the filmmaker's perspective, that there are actual objective errors in the making of The Last Jedi. Yeah. And it even goes so far as like, I was rewatching it the other day because I'm a masochist and a sucker for punishment. And there's a scene where on the shuttlecraft with DJ, the Benicio del Toro character.
Who had
and
the
Finn.
Oh my God, yeah, that's. I'm sorry. I'm just being reminded of the speech impediment that he was given. In fact, the first time I saw the movie, I didn't even notice his speech impediment, and then the second time, I was like, wait a minute, why does he have a speech impediment?
That was a decision Del Toro made. That
Okay.
wasn't Rian Johnson.
Okay, gotcha.
Del Toro is known for kind of bringing these elements to these characters, and because of his eventual betrayal, Del Toro saw him as a snake.
Yeah.
And so he gave him this little slither in his speech.
Yeah.
And that's actually that's an acting technique where actors will. Jack Nicholson used to do this a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they'll imagine an animal and they'll take on that animal's qualities to try to, communicate like a character has like these kind of qualities. But that wasn't a Rian Johnson decision.
Okay.
That was a decision that as a director, Rian Johnson allowed Benicio del Toro to add into his character.
Yeah.
But the example I was trying to give was there's a scene in there where DJ and Finn are talking, and it's kind of like they're looking at this holographic image of like spaceships, on this table. And there's a scene where they actually break the 180-degree rule in the filmmaking where, the camera is, facing one direction.
Yeah.
And then the next shot, it's coming from the other direction facing this way. So like the characters basically swap.
Yeah.
And that is like film school 101. That's something where it's like, you don't do that because it confuses the audience. And it was just a one scene where that happened. But I was like, Rian Johnson, you should know, or Rian Johnson, you should know, you don't break the 180-degree rule in a scene where two people are talking to one another. Like it literally goes from like, Benicio del Toro's here and Finn's here. Then in the next shot that is edited to, Benicio's here, Finn's here. And then the next shot, they're back to where they originally were. And that's just bad filmmaking.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't expect to see something like that in a AAA Star Wars movie, but there it is. Like even George Lucas didn't do that.
Yeah. Well, at least for him, I guess his defense would be that he was trying to subvert everyone's expectations, including the filmmaking community, it seems.
Well, I think it just comes down to the fact that Rian Johnson is not a very good director.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that, part of a director's job is to be the overseer of a story. It's to tell a story in a way that audiences will enjoy it. And Rian Johnson, I've gone back and I've watched his former movies. Like I've watched Brick, and I've rewatched Looper.
Yeah. And
there's actually some really like deep, well written stuff in those movies in terms of like theme and like very like kind of Brainiac type. Like if you're a film junkie, like you eat that stuff up.
Yeah.
Like that's the type of movies that he makes.
I've always said like I love Brick. Like Brick is actually I love that movie so much. And it's just very clever to me. Looper's one that hasn't aged well. Like I remember when I first saw it, I thought it was pretty good, and then having seen it subsequent times, there are elements of the film that just don't quite hold up. So I know that he has the capacity to put
if you look at Looper as a sci-fi film, I think you're correct. But if you look at it from the point of view where thematically it's about a cycle of violence amongst family members, where you have an abusive father who hurts the mother, and eventually the kid grows up to be just like the father or worse.
Yeah. And
when you look at it from that thematic point, like what Rian Johnson was trying to say with that movie is like, we're all in these loops where, like the father has one loop and then the son recreates that loop, and we're all trapped in these loops.
Yeah.
And the climax of that film, when Joseph Gordon-Levitt sees his loop and sees what he turns into and sees what the child turns into because of him, he decides to break that cycle of violence by killing himself and freeing that child from that cycle of violence so that he can grow up to become a good man. And it's a really deep theme that, that's kind of Rian Johnson's strength is like thematically, like if you look at The Last Jedi thematically, each of the 4 story threads in that movie, thematically, those story threads are actually really powerful. Like he has a lot of like Finn subplot. When I first saw the movie, I was like, well, Finn subplot's terrible. Like you could pull it out of the movie and you wouldn't miss anything. And I still think that that's true. But upon analyzing it, because I'm going to be doing an article on each of the subplots of the movie.
Yeah.
Finn actually has a very strong character arc that occurs throughout the film, and I think that's one of the things that is one of Rian Johnson's strength, and probably one of the reasons why like he continues to work in Hollywood. Because I like to say that, for instance, Tim Burton.
Yeah.
You know who Tim Burton is, right? The director.
Yeah.
So I don't like a lot of Tim Burton's movies. I find like a lot of his movies are very poorly done. Like they're visually interesting, but the story is just not very good.
Yeah.
He has maybe like a handful of really good movies, but he continues to make like these movies. Everyone thinks he's brilliant. And I was always like, why does everyone think that he's so brilliant? Like most of his movies aren't very good. And then I listened to a commentary track of his one time, and I think it was for Planet of the Apes. And, you know, like I did not like his take on Planet of the Apes, but when I listened to his commentary, I was like, wow, this movie's really good. And it was because like his natural charisma and his ability to explain his thought process behind why he made certain choices was really fascinating. And I was like, no wonder everyone in Hollywood is on this guy's Johnson, because like, you know, like he can walk into a room and he can tell you these ideas and he'll get you on board, and everyone will drink his Kool-Aid, and it doesn't matter if the movie ends up being bad or not, because like he's cool and you want him to succeed. I think it's kind of the same thing with Rian Johnson, at least when it comes to Kathleen Kennedy and the people at Lucasfilm, in the sense that where he can sit down and he can tell everyone like, look, this is the theme behind Finn's arc, and this is why I want to do this way, and blah blah blah, and everyone's like, yeah, cool, yeah, I'm down with that. But then like in execution, if you just look at it at a surface level, it's like, dude, this could have been done way better. You know, and I think that's Rian Johnson's big downfall, is the fact that he's an indie director who has like these deep concepts and ideas, and he's not cut out for big budget popcorn spectacle. Like he just, especially something as beloved as Star Wars. I was really excited before The Last Jedi came out, because I liked him as a writer and director, and I was looking forward to seeing what he was able to do. And I honestly think that his new trilogy might actually be good if it ever gets made. Because
do you think it will ever get made? Because again, you have that mindset of you don't think Rian Johnson's in as much trouble as some of us think that he's in. So do you think he's going to get a whole trilogy, or do you think they're going to try and test the waters to see if it'll make money?
Well, here's the thing. So the way this works is that, you know, Kathleen Kennedy hired him to develop a new trilogy. And, you know, that development process, especially considering how slow he writes, it could take, you know, years to develop and get ready. So most studios will continue to do the development process. And I think what's going to happen is that Rian Johnson will continue to develop his new trilogy, and Kathleen Kennedy will continue to, you know, make new Star Wars movies. And if the Star Wars movies continue on this downward trend, even after the readjustment, you know, just doing a movie every 2 years, or, you know, what have you. Like if it continues a downward trend, then Disney might step in and you know, put someone new in charge, and that person would decide, okay, well, you know, we've spent all this time and effort and money developing this stuff, but it wasn't developed under me, and so we're going to scrap it. And that happens a lot in Hollywood, where if leadership changes in a studio, a lot of the former projects that were, you know, getting ready to be made under the previous leadership get scrapped, because the mentality is like, well, the person who got fired for a reason. All their stuff sucked, so I'm just going to get rid of all their stuff and start doing my own stuff. And it's happened all the time since the dawn of Hollywood. So that's the only situation I could foresee where Rian Johnson's trilogy gets scrapped. If Kathleen Kennedy continues to be at the head of Lucasfilm, I guarantee you that trilogy will go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the big question. I think Rosefire makes a good point. Says, I would accept an original trilogy if Ryan Johnson created his own hero on a hero's journey and deconstructed it. But deconstructing Star Wars is tearing down 40 years of legends. No wonder people are mad. So I think that's a good point, saying that if he had been given his own story with his own characters, that maybe people would not have been nearly as mad at his work. I mean, it still probably would have had those narrative flaws because, as you said, he kind of has that history of not being the strongest of writers, and even he's admitted that fact that he's not a very strong writer. So it probably still would have had some of those flaws within it, but at the very least he would not have, you know, been doing those flaws with, you know, beloved characters.
Well, the issue that when it came down to the writing of The Last Jedi was that, so the way it worked was Kathleen Kennedy hired J.J. Abrams to come on and do The Force Awakens. And I don't know if you know much about how J.J. Abrams works, but he's not really... He started off his career as a writer, and his father, Gerald Abrams, was actually a mentor of mine because he went to Penn State, where I graduated from film school. Oh. I met him through there, and he was kind of like my godfather while I worked in Hollywood, where I would email Gerald Abrams and ask him about stuff.
Oh, wow.
And so, like, Gerald Abrams was a guy, he had a background in TV movies. Like, that was his thing. It was like he'd made for TV movies throughout his career. And that's how JJ kind of like got his foot in the door with his dad's help. And, you know, when I first met Gerald, his JJ's claim to fame was having written Regarding Henry, starring Harrison Ford. And this was before Alias came out. This was like a year or so before Alias first came out. And I became a big fan of J.J. Abrams through that show. But like all shows that J.J. Abrams was involved in, it kind of fell apart as it got towards the end there. But if you look at how J.J. Abrams handled Star Trek, for instance, he's not really someone who writes anymore. He's kind of like more the Spielberg type, where he has these ideas and these concepts, and he gives them to the writers, and he's like, hey, come up with something. And then the writers will go and they'll do their thing, and he'll come back and give them the script, and JJ will go through and make changes or additions as necessary. So he's kind of like the big picture guy. With Ryan Johnson, he's an actual writer. Like, he actually sits down and he writes the script himself. He's what we call an auteur, where he does everything. He's the writer and director. He's the overall kind of visionary of the movie. Yeah. And the way that this worked was when JJ was making The Force Awakens, Ryan Johnson was writing, you know, trying to develop the script for The Last Jedi. And he didn't really have, like, he had the shooting script for The Force Awakens, and he got to see like a handful of dailies. But other than that, he didn't have a finished movie to go off of. So a lot of his decisions, in terms of crafting the story for The Last Jedi, were not based off of the final Force Awakens film. Okay, it was based off of just what he knew from J.J. Abrams and from the script and from the dailies that he was going to get to work with. And the way J.J. Abrams works is like he changes crap as he shoots all the time. Yeah. So Ryan Johnson didn't really have a lot to go off of. He was kind of like, he kind of had a flashlight in the dark, and he'd get glimpses of where he was, but then he's like, you know, screw it, I'm going to go forward and blaze my own path on this one. Yeah. And so that was problem number one, is that he didn't really have a good foundation with which to jump off of. Yeah. Problem number two was that he had too many characters to deal with. If you look at Empire Strikes Back, there's only two subplots in that movie. You have the main thread with Luke, and then you have the plot thread with Han Solo being chased by the Empire. Mm-hmm. Well, with Ryan Johnson, like, he had Rey, Finn, and Poe, and Luke Skywalker. Mm-hmm. And so, like, he had to come up with ways to do all this. And originally, his initial concept, which I wish he had kind of stuck with, was that Finn and Poe were going to run off and have, like, their little side adventure together. So
yeah, as long as that could have happened, like, I already have a feeling that a lot of people would probably agree that that would have been a more interesting journey, seeing that they already had that kind of brotherly chemistry in a lot of ways. And also, had it not been on the damn casino planet, I think it would have been also better received as well.
Well, the problem was, at least according to them, was that it was too buddy-buddy. There was no conflict between Finn and Poe. Yeah. So he made the decision to separate them into their own stories and give Finn a foil to kind of play off of in the form of Rose, and to give Poe an antagonist in the form of Admiral Holdo to fight against.
Which I think in retrospect, most people can agree was probably one of the worst decisions to make, because it made two awful storylines, at least from my own point of view, two awful storylines.
And you know, it comes down to you know, Rian Johnson basically, you know, like he grew up a Star Wars fan, so he was a fan, but his sensibilities are such that he likes different things than I think most general audiences do.
Yeah.
And when he decided to split these characters up into 4 different story threads, he had so much ground that he now had to cover that things got really jumbled. Yeah. And keep in mind, like, basically the way Rian Johnson wrote this script, he moved to San Francisco to be closer to where Lucasfilm's headquarters is based. And he would go into their offices and meet with the story group. And he would get on a whiteboard and he would write down all these ideas. He's like, I have an idea for a casino planet. I have an idea for, you know, this massive, you know, first order ship. I have an idea for, you know, this and this and this and that. What do you guys think? And then the story group would be like, well, there's precedence for this in, you know, Star Wars canon, and we like this idea, and have you thought about this? Then Rian Johnson would take notes and he'd be like, okay, great meeting. I'll see you guys in a week. And then he'd go back and he'd take their notes and he'd kind of come up with more stuff, and he'd show up at the offices again. He'd do the whiteboard thing again, and then he'd get feedback. And so it was kind of like one of these like long drawn out development processes. But keep in mind that Rian Johnson, like, because he's a slow writer, he usually took his time with his scripts. But with this one, he only had like a year worth of development before like he had to start shooting. And he was developing a story based off of a movie that wasn't completed yet and was actually changing as it was being made. So he was juggling a lot of balls, and I think like he just couldn't keep up with them, and he had to do everything like much quicker than he normally would. And he was also getting feedback from people in the story group who I don't think were very talented. So there's all these factors that are going into his crafting of the script.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like, he was originally supposed to develop the third movie as well, but because of the, you know, compressed time of getting The Last Jedi made, they made the decision to bring on a different director with Colin Trevorrow to handle episode 3. And then Kathleen Kennedy fired him and had to bring JJ back on after that snafu. So, you know, I think there were just a lot of factors that lent themselves to Rian Johnson not being as careful with the crafting of the story as he normally is. Yeah. But I also think that he was not the right person to hire to handle the main beloved Star Wars characters and stuff like that. And I also don't think JJ was the right person either, because I think his take on Han Solo and his take on Luke and all these other people weren't correct either. So, you know, I would have rather seen them bring in like a Ron Howard to begin with, as opposed to, you know, falling back on him after like the young whippersnappers had their shot and failed. Yeah. You know? So I think that's a big factor in why The Last Jedi turned out to be the train wreck that it was.
Yeah, story-wise, anyway. And what would you say? I mean, because obviously we have the, you know, part 3 of this trilogy coming out in 2019. Do you think there's any way, from a story perspective, since that's kind of your forte, what do you think? Is there anything that they can do story-wise to bring this narrative back on track, or do you think that this trilogy, when it's seen all 3 films together, do you think it's just going to be seen as a giant train wreck narratively?
Well, here's what I would have done. I think one of the big issues with The Last Jedi was the fact that it felt like the final movie in a story. So, like, if you look at The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi as like one big long movie, they work a little bit better than as the first and second part of a trilogy. Yeah. So I would have treated those 2 movies as like one, you know, two-part story. And then I would have taken the next movie and planned out 2 movies as another 2-part story. So you'd have episode 7 and 8, and then episode 9 and 10. Yeah. And each one kind of told their own like overarching story, which was under like the new like idea. And I think JJ is kind of running into that right now, where he's like, well, maybe we should split episode 9 into 2 films. But that's kind of how I would have played it out, because, you know, The Last Jedi ruined so many great story threads that could have been tied up in the last movie. that, you know, it's better to kind of reset and have episode 9 kind of create new story threads that people can get passionate about once more, and then pay those off in a 10th, you know, final film. So that's kind of how I would have approached it personally.
Yeah.
But I think that what it's going to come down to is, from what I understand, episode 9 is going to be called A New Order. And I think that has to do with Rey starting a new Jedi Order. And ultimately, you're going to have a situation where Kylo Ren is defeated, but the First Order prevails, and a new threat's going to be rising that, you know, this new Jedi Order has to take care of in future trilogies and stuff like that. So I don't think we're going to see anything new, but I do think that JJ is probably a smart enough filmmaker to be aware of the issues that The Last Jedi caused, and so I think he's going to try to address those. Might be too little, too late, but I feel like if JJ can kind of get out of this terrible habit of just kind of cribbing off of, you know, previous nostalgia, like he did with Star Trek and he did with you know, The Force Awakens, and actually bothers to, you know, try and tell like a good story as opposed to try to do fan service.
Yeah.
Episode 9 might have a chance, but you know, it's hard to say because like I don't have any connection to that production. So
I guess
all I know is that J.J. Abrams has this like track record of kind of starting stuff and then not finishing it. And the idea that he's going to, you know, finish this trilogy, there's a very good chance that he'll drop the ball, but I'm hopeful. I want Star Wars to be good.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of us do, and I think that's sometimes what people fail to realize in our complaints is that we all just want the same thing. We all want good Star Wars films, and we just feel like, especially with The Last Jedi, because I'm someone, I will still defend The Force Awakens because I thought it was an entertaining film. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. But at least it was entertaining enough to, you know, to get the story started, and I feel like it had to kind of parallel A New Hope in so many ways because it was starting the story. It was trying to get people back in saying this is Star Wars and we're going to do it right. And it was like, here, you know, here's kind of like our kind of like, you know, here's a little bit of a nibble of what we can do, and then 8 and 9 were going to be their own like stories and, you know, go in different directions. I just don't think anyone thought that The Last Jedi was going to go in the directions that it was going to go in at least from a narrative perspective. And it's just left a lot of people sour because of that. And I just, for me, especially since you've talked about these issues in your articles about how things like Space Leia and things like the hyperspace ram really leave a lot of problems for any future and also past Star Wars films. So do you think they're going to try and address at least, like, for me, like the hyperspace ram thing is a huge thing. Like, do you think they're going to try and address that, or do you think they're going to try and explain why it was capable of happening in that situation so that they can isolate it, or do you think they're just going to ignore it and act like that's just how things work?
I think they're going to ignore it.
Okay.
If you look at how JJ handled The Force Awakens, you start off with basically a reset where like the First Order and the Resistance. First of all, the Resistance is part of the New Republic. So why isn't it just the New Republic? Why does it have to be this faction within the New Republic called the Resistance? What exactly are they resisting? They're the ones in power. And how the world did the First Order come into being? Like, he didn't address any of this stuff. He just kind of said like, okay, well, this is the way things are now, and we're going to go into the story. And I think if he gets caught up, and if you look at Lost, they did the exact same thing in Lost too, where, you know, like they did these things that didn't make any sense, and rather than address them, they just decided to move on. Yeah. And it was the same with Alias. And you know, so he has this habit of just kind of like glossing over like really important things, hoping the audience will forget about it, because he's like, well, I want to tell my story, and if I can wow the audience with enough glitz and glamour, they'll forget about all the mistakes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that when it comes to The Last Jedi, if he has to take away time from telling his story in order to fix the problems from The Last Jedi, it's kind of going to go counter to how he normally operates.
Okay.
So plus I think like he also has to be careful, not like he doesn't want to insult Rian Johnson or admit that, you know, Lucasfilm did anything wrong with the second movie in the trilogy, because it's not just about fixing the previous movie's mistake. It's also about keeping a united front up for the studio and the public and stuff like that. Like all the behind the scenes drama really hurt Solo, so he probably doesn't want to create any drama behind this movie. He just wants to kind of move forward with it.
I don't know, man. I think that starting something like that would actually probably get more people on, because I know a lot of people that watch my channel are just ready to boycott this film and are just so tired of the nonsense.
They are, but this comes down to the bubble, that I told you about, where the people in Hollywood who are on this level, the level of J.J. Abrams, the level of Rian Johnson, Kathleen Kennedy, they live in a bubble where people handle them. They don't tell them the truth. They tell them what they want to hear. They look at any criticism. They either have learned to dismiss criticism outright, or they look at criticism as something that stems from not from their work, but from a bias of some type.
Yeah.
Like, these people just don't get what I'm going for, or they're misogynist, or they're racist, or like whatever. So like they pass off this criticism as something other than what it is. You talked about the divide in the Star Wars fandom before, but it's kind of interesting because everyone's just defending their love for Star Wars. The people who like The Last Jedi, they're defending The Last Jedi because they love Star Wars. But the people who criticize The Last Jedi are doing it because they love Star Wars.
Yeah.
So like we're all coming from the same place. We just have different methods of doing this stuff. But when it comes to this bubble that these major Hollywood creatives are in, you need to have some type of rhino skin or some type of obliviousness to the criticism out there, because no matter what you do, you can't please everyone.
Yeah.
Like even like with my books, I think my books are pretty well written, but I get the occasional bad review, and I'll read those. I'll like, I want to tell this guy slept with his mother and that he's ugly and blah blah blah. But you kind of have to learn to disassociate yourself from these criticisms.
Yeah.
And in some way invalidate them, because otherwise you just be depressed constantly because everyone's constantly criticizing you.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this stuff, even valid stuff, like like my articles, I can guarantee you Rian Johnson, if he read one of my articles, he'd just be like, that's just your opinion, man. Because you have to do that. You don't want to admit that you're terrible or you're not talented or something along those lines.
Well, it's interesting,
and because of this boycott of the criticism, that's one of the reasons why I think Star Wars isn't going to fully course correct like it should.
Well, like you mentioned, saying like that they live in this bubble, and I definitely agree. I think that a lot of these people just live in their bubble and they just won't care about it one way or the other. But something that I find interesting is that I made a video where I talked about Solo and I talked about John Kasdan, and then John Kasdan actually reached out to me and had a conversation with me about it. So I just feel like there's some people out there who might care just a little bit about what's being said about them.
The difference between someone like John Kasdan and someone like J.J. Abrams is that John Kasdan is a nobody. He's the son of kind of like a Hollywood legacy. His father, I think, is very talented, but not so much in recent years. And he's kind of like a Max Landis to me. Like he's from a Hollywood legacy, and he got a job based off of his dad's clout. And unfortunately, his name is now associated with the biggest flop in Star Wars history.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have like he can reach out to a YouTuber and have a conversation. Someone like J.J. Abrams, they can't do that.
Yeah.
Because the minute, like if J.J. Abrams were to reach out to you, he would be legitimizing everything you ever said about him. And plus, just the nature of being a major Hollywood director, they are so sheltered.
Yeah.
Like when you're on set as a director, you are the 4-star general. You are the guy. The only ones above you are like the studio executives and the producers, and they're usually not on set.
Yeah.
You're usually the top guy on set. And because of that, you have all these different people who work for you handling different departments like cinematography, lighting, catering, all these different things that nobody thinks about. And you trust them all to do their job and handle and put out the fires so that you can just focus on getting the movie made and telling the story and dealing with the actors.
Yeah.
Because the minute a director gets distracted, that's when production falls behind. That's when things go over budget. That's when things start to fall apart. And there's all types of things. So like directors are usually very sheltered while they're on set. And I guarantee you, like J.J. Abrams is not reading Twitter and not watching YouTube and stuff while he's shooting a movie.
Yeah.
You know, if they are monitoring that stuff, they're doing it from the Lucasfilm offices, and if there's any problem, they'll call up, you know, the second unit director or the line producer or like whatever.
Yeah.
They'll say, hey, can you tell JJ about this issue we're having? We need his input on something or something along those lines.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Yeah, because it's interesting because of the whole Mike Zero situation that's recently happened, where Rian Johnson had openly admitted that on set for the film they would talk about Mike Zero and they would talk about his videos. So someone, a part of his team, would actually watch Mike Zero's videos and relay back the information. So I do think it's interesting that that's now been admitted to happening on a Star Wars set.
Well, I mean, Rian Johnson probably never watched any of Mike Zero's videos.
Yeah.
He just probably knew what people told him, and so like they just made a joke about it, you know, and that was the extent of his awareness of Mike Zero. I mean, like, yeah, he might have watched some YouTube videos after the movie ended, but I guarantee you, while they were shooting, he probably didn't have time to do that type of stuff. When I was directing movies, oh my God, it was grueling.
Yeah.
It was one of those things where from 5 a.m. to like 9, 10 p.m. at night, you know, like you barely got a lunch hour, you know, because, you know, while I was eating lunch, I was having to like look over shot lists, and I was having to deal with, you know, there was one situation where we were shooting in a bathroom on an actual location in a restaurant, and the deal is that, you know, we would buy the lunch for the cast and crew at the restaurant in addition to paying like a small like rental fee for the day. And this was like, you know, during a time period where the restaurant wasn't even open, and in exchange they would let us shoot in this bathroom. And so, you know, we show up on set, we get everything, you know, situated, and then like, you know, the cast and crew have their lunch.
Yeah. And
right after lunch, the owner of the restaurant comes and he's like, yeah, I want $5,000. Otherwise I'm kicking you guys out here and calling the cops. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, we had a deal. And he's like, yeah, well, I'm changing the deal. And so I turned to Jeremy and I was like, Jeremy, how quick do you think you could shoot this scene? He's like, I'm ready to go. And the other actor in the scene was like, me too. I'm like, okay. And so I go back to the restaurant owner. Is like, all right, we're going to be out of here in 20 minutes. We just need to pack up our stuff. And so like we go in the bathroom, we shoot the scene in 15 minutes, and then we pack up in 5 and we leave. And I mean, that's the type of thing as a director that you deal with. You get these unexpected curveballs thrown at you.
Yeah.
But when you're on the A-list level, when you're on the level where like, you know, you have $100 million at your disposal or more, people handle those things. And so like you're very sheltered. Like it's kind of hard to explain to someone who has never been in that situation before. But I guarantee you that Rian Johnson, J.J. Abrams, these guys, they're aware of all these like internet critics, but they don't really know them. They haven't listened to their criticism. They don't really bother with them, because if they get depressed after hearing some of this stuff, then that could totally ruin the day of shooting. You know, like that can set them back. So like they're very sheltered while doing this stuff.
Yeah, I hear you. So I guess just do you want to give a shout out to yourself where people can find you for more writing, for your books, for the articles that you write? Obviously, I've talked about medium.com, but any shout outs that you want to give to where people can find you?
Yeah, if you go on Amazon.com and you just search for Earthman Jack, that's my book series. You can find me there. You can also search for my name, Matthew Kadish, Kadish. You can see all my stuff on there. You can find me on Twitter. I'm pretty active on there, Matthew Kadish, at Matthew Kadish. And if you go on medium.com, I'm posting articles on there all the time. You can follow me on there to get updates of when I post new articles. And it's mostly looking at, you know, movies from a storytelling perspective, and in the future some TV shows and novels as well, where I basically like I break down certain concepts, certain proven storytelling concepts, and apply them to movies that do them incorrectly, and try to make the case of like, well, you know, here's an example of a movie that violated this concept and why it didn't turn out so well. And so like it's for like the film buffs and the storytellers and the aspiring writers, they can be really interesting to read. So if you go on medium.com and search for Matthew Kadish, you can find me on there too. Great.
Yes. And also, I mean, I just want to say I've read like at least, let's see, I read 3 of the ones on The Last Jedi, and then there's one that I'm still trying to find the time, because the great thing about the work that you do on Medium is that you don't just you don't just like throw a blurb out there and see what sticks. You take your time. You are very patient with it, and you put so much detail into it. And so because of that, it's not just going to be a quick blog post. You have to dedicate the time to actually read through it, because again, it's just so much research is done for the articles, which just makes it amazing and makes every article just worthwhile. And so there's one that you wrote about the concept of the
reboot.
Exactly, about the all-female reboot. And I cannot wait to dive into that, because it's just, that's something that I've had issues with for a long time, but I can't wait to see your perspective on it.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the research for that article was that the MPAA actually had statistics on a lot of the new Star Wars films in terms of the gender breakdown of audiences and the racial breakdown. And it tells you like 60% of the people who watch the new Star Wars movies are men, and 65% of the people who watch the Star Wars movies are white. And it's a very interesting demographic look, because as a storyteller, you want to cater to your audience. And the kind of common belief in Hollywood is like, oh, we have to cater to the minorities out there. We have to give women a bigger presence. We have to give African Americans and Hispanics and all these other groups a bigger presence. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But if you look at the actual people who make up the core audience of these things, I think African Americans were like either 12 or 15%. I think it was 12%, and Hispanics were like 15%.
Yeah.
And women, even though like 40% of the audience is women, the vast majority of the audience is male. And so like when you start waging war against white males, you're effectively alienating up to 65% of your audience. I just find it interesting, because knowing who you're supposed to cater to, knowing your audience, knowing who's going to be consuming your story, that's like 90% of storytelling right there, is knowing who's going to be consuming your art.
Yeah.
And when you wage a war against them, or you don't take them into account, or you try to marginalize them, you're just hurting yourself, and you're hurting the end product. And so like I don't think like we need to have less minorities or women in Star Wars films, but I do think that we can't be dismissing white men in the process of doing so. So
yeah,
I found that interesting when I was doing my research for the all-female reboot article.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, it is fascinating to see, why they are taking so many of these properties and trying to turn them into something that, that they were never, and trying to reach out to, an audience that it just isn't really.
Well, if you get around to reading my article, I go into great detail about that. There was actually a really interesting study done by the government that broke down genre preferences of movies based off of gender.
Yeah.
And how women prefer certain genres over men, and men prefer certain genres over women.
Yeah.
And why the movie industry caters more to men than women. It's not because of sexism. It's because men prefer greater number of genres than women do. Mm-hmm. And so there's just more of them out there to consume that stuff. And so like they get more movies made for them.
Yeah, and people wouldn't want to accept that. Yeah, people wouldn't want to accept that, because that means that there has to be a difference between men and women, which in today's society is just like, oh no, that can't be. We're all the same. Every single one of us. We all have the same interests and likes and desires and everything.
That was the article that I was most scared to publish, I think.
I bet you got some backlash for that one a little bit.
Actually, I didn't get any backlash.
Really?
At all.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great.
Even in the comments, people can be like, "Well, I disagree with you, but you use so much data. It's hard to like attack you about it." Because like I didn't say like women are bad, or female-centric movies are bad, or like nobody wants to see a all-female movie or whatever.
Yeah.
I just said that when you're trying to take established franchises and tell the audience who loves those franchises this is no longer for you, and we want to attract a new audience, that you just end up hurting the franchise ultimately. And then I just showed all the evidence to support my argument about it. So I was pretty pleased that I didn't get called a misogynist or like whatever for publishing that article. Yeah. But I really tried to kind of divorce myself from the this movie sucks and you suck if you like it type mentality, and just look at it from not from an audience perspective, but from the perspective of an artist, because I really believe that the whole argument that, if you can't objectively look at something, if you can't objectively critique something, then how is anyone going to learn? How is anyone going to improve in their art? So from a craftsman perspective, I think it's important to set objective standards for art and then analyze stuff based off of that. And it's only once you understand all these rules that you can start to break them and experiment, because the people who just aren't aware of the rules and say, like, I'm going to do this, like that's not true art. That's just you being ignorant and trying something based off a flight of fancy, as opposed to actually deliberately doing something to experiment. And I think it's important to, make sure that those lines are clearly drawn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to give a huge shout out to Jeffrey Toon, who donated $750 through Streamlabs, and he said, good stream. So, and I've been reading the comments, and a lot of people love your take, love your insight, because you do have that background, and so you can speak from your own personal experiences, and speak from it in a way that a lot of us on YouTube aren't really able to speak from. Like, obviously we can speak from what makes sense to us and from what we've read, from what we've seen, but most of us were never in the industry, so we can't really know a whole lot about it. And so having that perspective, I think, is interesting. A lot of people in the chat seem to like that perspective, so thank you so much.
And if I can do one more plug real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
If you guys go over and subscribe to me on Medium, an upcoming series of articles, probably 3 or 4, are going to be an expose about the internal civil war that's been going on with Star Trek since 2005. I used to work at Paramount Studios. I was actually there during the shooting of Enterprise, and I have a lot of contacts still at Paramount, and I've heard lots of interesting and inside baseball things about the state of Star Trek and what's been going on with that. And I decided to write a big expose that kind of covers the history of Star Trek and the business quagmire that it's currently in, and why Discovery is the way it is, and a bunch of other stuff. And so that will be coming out, if not this month, then maybe next month.
Okay.
I started off as just a quick article, and it's already 60 pages in manuscript form. So it's going to be broken up into a number of articles. But if you're a Star Trek fan and you're interested in, the drama behind Alex Kurtzman and, Discovery and Les Moonves and all this other stuff, it's going to get really in depth into everything that's been going on there, from information from my contacts and my personal experience with these people and with Star Trek and all this stuff. So if you liked all the inside baseball that we talked about in this stream, that article is going to be 10 times worse with that stuff. So be sure to subscribe to me, follow me on Medium to find out when that comes out, or Twitter, because I'll tweet about it too.
And I know one person who's going to be interested. Do you know Mecha Random 42? She used to be Random.
She used to be. She had a different name.
Yeah, she used to be Random Game User 42.
Yes.
And she loves
5 more months
Star Trek.
Random.
Yeah. So she loves Star Trek, and I mean, she was in the chat earlier, but I see just a lot of people talking about her, because as soon as she mentions Star Trek, the instant thing is to go to her, because that's kind of her bread and butter. That's what she loves to talk about, because she's had a lot of thoughts about the Star Trek Discovery and everything.
Well, actually,
going on.
I got Doomcock to not only acknowledge that I exist, but agree to proofread the article before I put it out there. So Lord Doomcock shall give his stamp of approval before it gets published, just to make sure that everything is as accurate as it can possibly be.
Awesome. Mecha Random says she's lurking, so she's so she hears it. That's awesome, man. Hail Lord Doomcock. Also another great channel, and I just feel so bad, because I say this all the time. I just don't have enough time in the day to dedicate myself to any more channels, and it's really sad, because I just see bits and pieces of what Doomcock does, and it's great. And all these other channels that exist out there, but also it makes it harder for me to read articles. That's why I read the articles that I did, and for yours I wanted to make sure that I was able to read them in advance, because they're not the articles that you can just read on the fly, because again, they're just so detailed. It would be, if it was just me and my analysis of every little thing, it would be, an hour-long video. And that's why every video that I've done has been 20 minutes, because that is, I look at the parts that I think that most people would be, interested to see. And I think that there's just there's so many good things in there. And so I just want to thank you so much again.
Ethan Van Scriver actually tweeted at me, and he wanted to do a video on my Space Leia article.
Nice.
And but he was like, but I need to think of a way to make it funny. Can you think of any way to make this funny? I'm like, nope. He still hasn't made a video about it. So.
Oh no. But say,
okay,
knowing him, I'm sure that he could find a way. You know.
I'm sure. I told him just to read it in the Jar Jar Binks voice, but I don't think he was down for that. So
yeah. Now that would be that would be amazing. Well, Matthew, I just want to say thank you so much again. For allowing for reaching out to me and allowing me to interview you, and also allowing me to use your articles in my videos, because again, you're doing some good stuff, and everything I've read has been great. And obviously, you say you're active on Twitter, so I love interacting with you on Twitter as well. And everyone here seems to. Oh, sorry. DJD Show says learn to speed read. I've gotten so many comments on my videos saying slow down, you talk too fast, and I'm just like. That's just
see. I get feedback saying like you need to learn how to be more economical in your writing. You write diarrhea of the keyboard. So.
And I feel like for some people, again, there are some people who are more likely to engage with material that is short, poignant, or short, succinct, to the point. But then there is still that place for longer takes. We do live in a world, we do live in a society where everything is just so instant gratification. Everything is just, everyone's become ADD almost by default, it seems. And it's like, no, take the time to read the article, because it's going to do you some good, because you're going to learn a hell of a lot by doing it. And also, there is a craft in writing out longer articles. Like, you can have good articles that are short and also good articles that are long. And I think that you hit the nail on the head every single time. And that's why don't think of it as like I only cover your articles that cover Star Wars, because I am wanting to dive into especially the one covering it's just I haven't had the time to do it, but I cannot wait, especially the little preface you gave for it and the explanation you gave. Cannot wait to dive into that article, because I'm gonna have so many thoughts, especially when it comes to 2016 Ghostbusters.
Yeah, like I'm not doing these articles to get famous or make money or anything like that. They're just kind of like a fun hobby.
Exactly.
For me. So like I don't care how many people read them. I don't care if they get shared around, and I'm not like trying to do clickbaity stuff. Mm-hmm. It's mostly just because like I have something to say, and I just want a platform to say it at. And like you do such a great job of covering articles. Like after I watch your videos, I feel like I don't need to read even my own article. I don't need to read it. I got all the high points. So.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things where, I same thing here. I do this because I love it and I'm having fun. And I tell that to everyone, like, I would not be doing this. I would not be, taking time away from other things that I could be doing if
you got a day job.
Yeah, exactly. Like I have a day job. Like I had the day off today, so I was able to do this, thank God. But I have other things that I could be doing, and there are other things that I could be pursuing. But I do this because it's fun. And if it ever stops being fun, then I'm going to stop doing it. But for now, it's just been a blast. And people like you and being able to have you on and talk to you, and everyone that's in the chat right now, I just want to thank everyone that's in the chat. We have 47 people watching. So I just want to say thank you to everyone watching. Again, guys, please go check out Matthew Kadish. Go check him out on Twitter. Go check him out on Medium.com. And also go check out his books on Amazon.com as well. And because
Earthman Jack.
What was that again?
Earthman Jack.
So go check out his series. And
you can go to earthmanjackseries.com.
How many books do you have in the series right now?
There are 5 out right now.
Okay.
I'm working on the next one, trying to get it out in December or January. But I spent the summer outlining like 4 new books, and awesome. So like I'm trying to get everything going for next year.
Great, awesome. Well, thank you so much again. For coming on, and we'll talk a little bit after the stream ends. But guys, I just want to thank y'all so much for joining the stream. Tina says thank you. Everyone in the chat is saying thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the interesting topic. And also,
welcome, Tina.
this is definitely a perspective, especially on Star Wars, that most of the people in my chat probably aren't really used to, because we're used to kind of that like instant gut reaction that we have to certain things. So being able to have that industry experience and understanding, I think, is something that a lot of these people will appreciate.
Like when you have knowledge of how Hollywood actually operates the business, a lot of what you see going on like makes more sense. So I just wanted to kind of share my insights. So because it's very easy to be like, fire Kathleen Kennedy, and like, oh, Rian Johnson's trilogy is going to get canceled, and it's just like, nope, you got to deal with reality.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much. And everyone watching, thank y'all so much for watching. Y'all are absolutely amazing. And I am going to try and see if I can stream maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. I'm not sure. It depends on what happens with this storm. It looks like it's going to be the type of storm where we get on the very lucky side that doesn't get like any rain and the sun's out shining. And even though it's only like 50 miles away from us, I don't know how it works. But hopefully everyone stays safe. If you are in an area that is going to get affected, stay safe. And guys, thank y'all so much for watching. Have a great day. And as always, God bless. Have a good one, guys.
Yeah, I hope I didn't monopolize too much of the stream. I talked way more than I thought I would, honestly. Sorry about that. Well, hopefully it was interesting. Like I honestly can't tell anymore. I was like there were so many times where I lost my train of thought and I was like, oh, what was I talking about? Are you going to publish this on YouTube?